And it's BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, everybody. Today is Thursday. Welcome to True Crime Talk Radio in the morning, coming to you every Tuesday and Thursday live at 10:30 a.m. And because today is Thursday, everybody please say hello to the Fox. So how's everybody doing? And we have DNA King is already here. DNA King says howdy. Howdy to you too. Good morning. All right, so I would like to begin with something that is a little bit different. Hello, Libius, welcome. And the title of this episode is The Recipe for Murder. And True Crime Talk Radio is going to be an episode where you can ask anything you want in the comments section. You can put anything you want in the live chat, and I'll try to respond to it. But I would like to start out with the recipe for murder because on some previous episodes of True Crime Talk Radio, I've been discussing the book The Cases That Haunt Us by John Douglas, the FBI profiler. And the story of the recipe for murder comes to us from 1997. It was an incident involving Samuel Scheinbein and Aaron Benjamin Needle. And they planned the murder of two of their classmates. They were students at the time in Montgomery County, Maryland, and their classmate was somebody who was infatuated with a girl that Samuel Scheinbein liked. And he concocted this plan to murder him because, he had a crush on a girl. He wanted to kill the rival. Very, very premeditated, very calculated. But in an odd turn of events, he decided that he wanted to choose a victim as a practice target. And then his companion, Aaron Benjamin Needle, got into a physical altercation with an individual named Freddie Tello, and that ultimately ended up with Freddie Tello punching Aaron Benjamin in the face, and then he reported the story to Samuel Scheinbein, and that was the end of their hunt for a target. So they plotted and planned this murder, and what the prosecutors called this was the recipe for murder. They actually wrote out a series of steps to commit a homicide. And this was something that I think is more similar to a checklist rather than a recipe. They were writing stuff down like plastic bags, X-Acto knife, 14-inch boots, even just very, very specific items that they're putting into this type of recipe checklist. Very, very premeditated, very, very calculated. Cat Daddy Steve is here. Good morning, Cat Daddy Steve. And this is one where a lot of thought was put into the crime, but it also goes to show that even if criminals are planning things out, and even if people are making these types of murderous recipes, murderous checklists, they do not necessarily work. And what happened was with Freddie Tello, he was targeted by Samuel Scheinbein and Aaron Benjamin Needle, and he was attacked with a stun gun. And then they took his body to a garage. They beat him with a gun, not shooting him, but they beat him with a shotgun. And then they also asphyxiated him, strangled him. And then they cut the body up, dismembered him. And I remember watching this story on the news when I was a kid, always watching true crime, even back in 1997. Lifelong true crime follower here, like many of you. And they would talk about how Samuel Scheinbein murdered this individual named Freddie Tello, and he threw him out with the garbage. And that doesn't seem to be quite exactly what happened. What it seems like happened is that they took the body to a garage, dismembered him, placed the body into trash bags, and actually took him to an abandoned home or a vacant home at the time. And that's when the body was found. And the person who found the body actually just thought that it was a deer carcass that somebody had brought from a hunting trip. Then he realized that it was a person. So then the authorities began conducting their investigation, and ultimately it was traced back to Samuel Scheinbein and Freddie Tello. Then they just had a very big division, a very big one. Aaron Benjamin Needle was ultimately apprehended, and he committed suicide in a jail cell. Samuel Scheinbein did something different. He fled the country and he went to Israel. And this is not meant to start any type of political discussions. I know a lot of people have some strong opinions about Israel. This is not a political channel in any way. But what happened from that point was he is in Israel claiming that he's an Israeli citizen, even though he had never been there before. He said that he was a born Israeli citizen, citizenship through his father. And then they're trying to extradite him back to America. But Israel had no extradition treaty with the United States. And this is something, though, where I found very conflicted when I was reading this, because one thing they tried to do was to say that He had no real connection to the country of Israel. Therefore, he should be extradited back to the United States. He had never been there before. He had he didn't actually do anything with his citizenship prior to just going to the country to flee a murder charge. And I felt conflicted because I completely understand what you're saying. It's that concept of everything they are saying is true, but the law is still the law. Because in addition to true crime, I was watching Judge Judy in the People's Court for 20 years, and this stuff would come up all the time when the judge has to say, I don't get to do what I want. I have to do what the law says. And what happened is that there was even a ruling that determined, he did have Israeli citizenship, therefore he had the right to stay in the country. And I said I felt conflicted because I ultimately agree with that. Just thinking about the concept of just because somebody does not do a lot with their citizenship, just because they do not have an extremely strong personal connection to whatever country they're claiming citizenship to, if they are a citizen, then you're just going to be denying them their rights. And you could say that that sets a bad precedent, but there's something even more important than that. You're just denying people their rights because of convenience or because of some type of individual basis, and rights aren't necessarily meant to be interpretive like that. Your rights are supposed to be your rights. Like, say, for example, an American goes to South Korea, and maybe an American man and a South Korean woman have a baby, and the baby grows up with dual citizenship, and the father dies 3 months after she's born. And then she just grows up in South Korea, and she only speaks Korean, and she doesn't have any connection to the United States, never visits America, doesn't have any family there. But because she was registered as a citizen and through her father, she claims American citizenship and tries to go to America. Should she be denied rights of saying, you have no personal connections to America, therefore you're not a real American citizen? I think that would be completely unfair. And something very similar happened with Samuel Scheinbein and the murder of Freddie Tello. Now, they did send him to jail in Israel, and he was sentenced to, what was it, like 24 years, a very long amount of time. And you got to understand, somebody who makes a recipe for murder, somebody who makes a type of murderous checklist and actually goes through with the plan is going to be a little bit demented and a little bit far out. I mean, I shouldn't have said far out. Demented, deranged. People can be far out and they're completely harmless. They just have eccentric personalities. Demented and deranged. And Samuel Scheinbein was involved in criminal activities in Israel. And ultimately, he was killed in a shootout with the police. And it's just a terrible story all around. But this goes to show that there's a difference between just having the moment of ideation in relation to a murder and actually creating the recipe for murder, actually creating this type of murderous checklist. And if Samuel Scheinbein had gotten away with this crime back in 1997, his plan was to go on to become a serial murderer. Yes, he's going to murder another victim. Freddie Tello was the practice victim. So, as far as the way that this plan was concocted, it's just a budding serial killer, someone with homicidal tendencies, but the ideation is not the problem. It's the fact that he was contemplating it, drawing up the blueprints, and putting the plan into action. This is very different because Dr. Michael Stone even talks about this. Dr. Michael Stone, who created the hierarchy of evil, the 22-tiered system about judging and basing people's destructive tendencies and personalities and trying to determine which is more severe and which is the most inhumane, 22 levels. And what he said was, there are going to be times when the average person is going to contemplate murder. And the way that this happens is a father tells his son, I'm cutting off your allowance. And the son thinks, oh, I'm so mad, I'm going to kill you. Yeah, that comes to mind, that type of murderous idea. But he's not actually going to do it. That is something that a lot of us experience. And some people take this in a different direction where they do what Samuel Scheinbein and Aaron Benjamin Needle did was, and they start concocting a recipe for murder, a murderous checklist, writing out a very specific plan to put into action. And excuse me, got to say hello to the fox again. And we have some people in the chat here. We have Ray Grant, who says, I'm about to pull onto the Pittsburgh Parkway. I can't post, but I'll be listening. Ray Grant, thank you so much. And Melissa Tappa is here. She says, good morning. Melissa, good morning to you too. And we have Batman66, Viva El Nido. Muchas gracias, Senor Batman. And as far as the way that people go about calculating and planning these murders, I was talking about this recently on True Crime Talk Radio with the book The Cases That Haunt Us by John Douglas, because as an FBI profiler, John Douglas divides this into two separate sections. You have the organized murderers and the disorganized murderers. The organized murderers would be like Samuel Scheinbein and Aaron Benjamin Needle, the people who make the recipes for murders, the murderous checklist. And they were doing this, by the way. They were checking things off on their list: stun gun, X-Acto knife, trash bags. And that would be an extremely organized example of murder. And some of the other true crime content that I've been following recently relates to two murderers named Otis Toole and Henry Lee Lucas. I made a post recently in the community section of Black Box Online Radio about Henry Lee Lucas. He's referred to as the Confession Killer. And it's possible that he murdered 3 people, who knows how many. He would ultimately confess to over 3,000 murders. Otis Toole was in a similar situation where he would make murderous confessions, not as many as Henry Lee Lucas did, though, but these guys were ultimately a partnership, a criminal partnership, serial killer partnership, and these sets of behaviors are not extremely uncommon. But because I was just reading the book, The Cases That Haunt Us, and talking to you guys about organized versus disorganized serial killers, I encountered the stories of Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole, and I began to notice that Henry Lee Lucas appeared to be a much more organized murderer in terms of his false confessions. Who knows how many people he actually killed. And then with Otis Toole, he seemed like a rather disorganized killer, because some of the examples would be he goes into a store and he is just bothered by the way that somebody is looking at him, by the way that the cashier is looking at him. So he murders that person. That would be a disorganized murder, where there isn't an exact plan that was created, not the recipe for murder, not the checklist. It's impulsive. It's when somebody has created this type of, they haven't really created anything. Something bothers them. They did not go into that place with a specific intent to look for a victim. Somebody's walking by, and this type of murderous impulse is awakened in the killer. So as far as the actions and activities of Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole goes, I began to notice that there was a commonality among them. And one of the reasons why they became friends is they both experienced a particular type of humiliation when they were younger. And this relates to being forced to wear girls' clothes, being forced to dress up as girls. With Henry Lee Lucas, he was forced to dress up by his mother, and with Otis Toole, he was forced to dress up by his father, and they just found it to be humiliating and degrading. And this is not a story that is uncommon. These are not the only 2 case examples of serial killers that are forced to dress up as girls. Another clear one would be Fritz Harman, the vampire butcher of Hanover. He is a serial killer from Germany that was, again, forced to dress up like a girl, said that it was extremely traumatic, and he was called the vampire butcher of Hanover because he would actually bite the victims on the neck, and a variant of drinking the blood, but that story happened so long ago. You find that stories from the 1920s and 30s get misrepresented a little bit. And another example would be Charles Manson. And Charles Manson was not forced to do this by his mother or his father. Instead, he was forced to dress up by his uncle. And I remember this when I did the series on Stephanie Harlow's videos. Like, Stephanie Harlow, the true crime YouTuber, made a 6-part series on Charles Manson. And back in 2020, I did a direct response to that, and I have a playlist here for that here on Black Box Online Radio. And if you want to follow along with all of these discussions, you can hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. If you have not subscribed to Black Box Online Radio yet, please feel free to hit that subscribe button. Tune in every Tuesday and Thursday for True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. And, well, that's all, folks. But as far as Charles Manson's behavior, his uncle forced him to put on a dress, and he had to wear the dress for the rest of the day. And then the next morning when he woke up, his uncle put him in the dress again and told him that he had to go to school wearing that dress. And I found that what I said in the episodes that I did on that was that no matter what happens with Charles Manson in the future, no matter what he went on to experience, you still feel something where it's like, oh my God, I am sorry for that kid. And that's exactly what I was experiencing when I was watching the documentaries about Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole. With Henry Lee Lucas, there was this video that was made for the infographics channel, and while they aren't the most reliable source, there was the story that was just so saddening. Where they're talking about Henry Lee Lucas did not bond with his mother, he did not bond with his father, and the only real bonding that he had was with animals, particularly a mule that was on the family property in Virginia. He was from Blacksburg, Virginia, and his mother saw that he was bonding with the mule, so she killed it. And he just said, if he loved anything, she would destroy it. If he loved a goat, she would have killed the goat. And again, it's heartbreaking about the way that people act toward their own children. So some of the videos that I watched, just out of my own curiosity about Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole, were from the channel Breakfast Cereal, which is one of those true crime comedy channels that I couldn't really get into. I told you about the infographics video, which was pretty good for the infographics channel. It was about 37 minutes long, filled with information. And there was an episode that was uploaded under the title of not Profiling Evil. That's just the name that always stands out in my mind. But Program to Kill. That's what it was listed on in YouTube. But when I clicked on the link, it turned out it wasn't an episode of Program to Kill. It actually was a documentary called Confessions of a Serial Killer. Because Henry Lee Lucas would go on to be known as the Confession Killer. And he is somebody who confessed over 3,000 murders. And one of the murders that he was connected to was the murder of his own mother. And he just reached a breaking point once when he finally snapped after all these types of abuse: physical abuse, mental abuse, psychological abuse, somebody who shows no love and wants to destroy anything that he does love. So he stabbed her to death. And what they said about that one, about that story, was that that would be a case of second-degree murder, because even though there was no premeditation, even though that is absolutely not an organized murder, there's no recipe for murder in that one. When someone just reaches a mental breaking point because of all the constant physical and psychological abuse and they murder somebody, that is second-degree murder. And while I completely comprehend that analysis, I mean, Gypsy Rose Blanchard was also charged with second-degree murder for the murder of her mother, Dee Dee Blanchard. She was a victim of very serious abuse, and she concocted a plan to have her mother murdered. With Henry Lee Lucas, I thought of something else that I encountered in the true crime world, and it was from the show Forensic Files. And I remember a story once when somebody was not charged with second-degree murder, even though it seemed like a clear case of second-degree murder. He was charged with passion-provoked manslaughter. And if someone is the victim of very heinous abuse, I think that would also have been a reasonable charge for what Henry Lee Lucas was talking about. With Gypsy Rose Blanchard, there's a different aspect to this, and that is that she was charged with second-degree murder because her mother was abusing her for years. She was a victim of Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Her mother was Dee Dee Blanchard, who was forcing her to live and pretend like she had medical conditions that she didn't really have. Cancer and muscular dystrophy. Her mother made her use a wheelchair. When Gypsy Rose knew that she didn't need it, she had to undergo numerous medical procedures, even having her salivary glands removed. She had to have a feeding tube inserted and removed without anesthetic, and just some very, very painful, dehumanizing, and crippling things that were done to Gypsy Rose Blanchard. The difference is, though, she concocted an organized plan to murder her mother. She may have even been using something that was similar to the recipe for murder that was discussed by what I was talking about with the Samuel Scheinbein case. And that is that Gypsy Rose Blanchard got in touch with an individual named Nick Godejohn, and he became her boyfriend. And they launched this plan together. And Nick Godejohn committed the murder, and Gypsy Rose Blanchard was involved with the participation and creation of the plan. Therefore, she was charged with second-degree murder. And I can comprehend that. But at the same time, I think that that is an organized crime, whereas just in the heat of the moment when someone just absolutely breaks under the pressure, I think that that would qualify as passion-provoked manslaughter. But also, this is True Crime Talk Radio in the morning, so I would like to open up the floor to anybody. You can put anything in the chat that you want. You can share any of the ideas that you have about the true crime world. And every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I do shows here on Black Box Online Radio. Every Monday, I talk about the Zodiac Killer. Every Wednesday, about Jack the Ripper. And every Friday, about D.B. Cooper. And tomorrow will be Cooper Friday. So please feel free to tune in to any of that. Now, I would like to share one final detail about Samuel Scheinbein and the murder of Freddie Tello Jr., and that is that there was something that may have been very crafty about their recipe for murder. They're writing the things down that I told you about: stun gun, trash bags, and one of the items was 14-inch boots, or 14 shoes, like size 14 shoes. I shouldn't have said 14-inch, size 14 shoes. And neither of the participants in that situation, in the murder of Freddie Tello Jr., Aaron Benjamin Needle or Samuel Scheinbein, wore size 14 shoes or size 14 boots. They both wore about a 10 or a 10 and a half. And then the defense attorneys tried to create this entire situation of, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit. And that type of language was actually used in the discussions. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit. Something from the O.J. Simpson case and Johnny Cochran. And they're saying that these guys don't wear size 14 shoes, therefore they couldn't possibly have written this. I really would just like to know the truth about that. I'm not a psychic. I'm not a mind reader. I can't just put my mind into somebody else's past, especially that Samuel Scheinbein and Aaron Benjamin Needle have both passed away. Did they actually do that? Or was that something that was very crafty done by two budding serial killers, where they inserted a piece of false information to throw off the prosecution, to build some type of defense? I don't really know. Teenagers and early 20-somethings can be very devious like that. Teenagers can be very good liars. They can be very devious liars. But as far as the plans that were put in place by Otis Toole and Henry Lee Lucas, how does somebody confess to 3,000 murders, even 100 murders like Otis Toole, and not actually do them? Those two guys were telling these stories of how they're just going around the country killing people left and right. And why are people even believing that? Why are they even entertaining the subject? And the documentary Confessions of a Serial Killer was made by a British documentary team from England, and they had a point that they were trying to argue throughout this, very indirectly, almost some subtle types of English persuasion tactics, if you will. My British friends are very good at that, subtlety. And what they're showing is that the departments in the United States, maybe the state of Florida and the state of Texas, they wanted to close these cases. They wanted to close the unsolved homicides. It was beneficial to the departments to have a fall guy, to have a scapegoat, to have somebody who just, well, they have hundreds of cases, cold cases. They have hundreds of cases with no leads. They have hundreds of cases where there is something that just is not answered and cannot be answered. And then all of a sudden, you have a serial killer such as Henry Lee Lucas or Otis Toole that wants to confess to the crime. It's a bonanza for law enforcement. And in the documentary Confessions of a Serial Killer, one person from one of the Texas departments was being not exactly grilled, but he was being strongly confronted with the conflicts and the stories of Henry Lee Lucas. How could he say that he committed a murder in Texas when he was working in Florida at the time, and they have time cards and signatures on papers showing that he actually was in the state of Florida? And, it's supposed to like, that case by case basis, something to that effect, just kind of mumbling along and not wanting to talk about it any further. There were also a lot of stories that were shared about Henry Lee Lucas, even from infographics, stating that one of the ways they got all of these confessions out of him was that They just offered him cigarettes, food. In one slide, they even said steaks and milkshakes, and they're just talking about these stories. And it was something that would be very beneficial for someone who is already going to jail for life to just keep confessing to these crimes because he's getting rewarded. And one of the rewards is also being out of prison for a while they can visit certain crime scenes or sites of disposal for the bodies. And it was beneficial for him at the time. But in Confessions of a Serial Killer, I might actually take some of these segments and use it on Zodiac Monday for a type of comparing and contrasting exercise, if you will. They would just talk about how Henry Lee Lucas is openly stating on camera, yeah, I lied. I told them what they wanted to hear. They wanted to hear confessions, so I gave them confessions. And he's stating all of this stuff. This is in the documentary Confessions of a Serial Killer. And I told you it's posted on YouTube under the name of Program to Kill. But it wasn't an episode of Program to Kill. And that's the long and short of it. That's ultimately what he is just laying out, that he made it all up. Yeah, he was getting rewards for it. So my ultimate question to humanity, to society, to everyone is, why give this guy any stock at all? Why give any credence to this theory? Why are there people out there who are still believing any of this stuff? Yeah, you can call him the confession killer. I mean, I only use those serial killer nicknames on this channel so I can remember who the person is and what they did and where they were from, and just something that's like, it's like a set of memory techniques to keep all the stories in line. But as far as somebody like the Zodiac Killer of the 1960s, was the Zodiac Killer more someone who would concoct a recipe for murder, somebody who would just make like the checklist, write down everything that he would need? If you had asked me that back in 2020, I would have said absolutely yes. I thought that the Zodiac Killer of the 1960s was cold, methodical, and calculating on overdrive. I thought that the Zodiac was someone who wrote letters and ciphers, and the ciphers were all designed before 1969. The Z408, the Z340, the Z32, the Z13, not in that order, Z13, Z32. I thought those things were all made ahead of time, and they were released at calculated intervals, because it seemed like everything else the Zodiac was doing was calculated. I couldn't quite pinpoint the numbers aspect, like why choose to commit crimes on December 20th of 1968, July 4th, 1969, September 27th, 1969, October 11th, let alone the mailings of the letters and ciphers. But I think that the Zodiac, I thought at the time that the Zodiac was doing all of this in an extremely calculating way, recipe for murder, checklist for murder. But in reality, I had to take a step back from that. One of the reasons was that the 340 cipher was solved by David Orenchak, Earl Van Eyck, and Sam Blake, and that revealed the line, "That wasn't me on the TV show. I hope you're having lots of fun trying to catch me. That wasn't me on the TV show." And the TV show that aired someone pretending to be the Zodiac happened after the 408 cipher was created. So I had to admit that either I was wrong, or maybe the Zodiac could have only modified one line in the cipher, but I don't think so. I think that the Zodiac knew some things about codes, or maybe it was not so difficult for him to create the cipher codes, so he did that rather quickly. It wasn't all designed and calculated. Another thing that happened was I was reading Pat Brown's book, Killing for Sport, and she talked about how a serial killer can start out by committing the first crime in an unplanned way. The second crime is done to recreate the first crime, and then by the third crime, they're trying to establish a pattern of behaviors. And with the Zodiac, nothing makes sense. With Jack the Ripper, some things make sense. And they were discussing this in the documentaries about Henry Lucas and Otis Toole. And I believe it was an episode of the biography channel that was about Otis Toole. And they're talking about how he is someone who created, not exactly a persona. I mean, I'll just share the stuff about the Zodiac first. And that is that in this documentary episode on the Biography channel, they're saying that a serial killer creates the pattern by escalating. Maybe, maybe the crimes appear to be different, but what the serial killer is doing is building upon the previous crime because that's how people operate. They learn things. They take their experiences and then they put them into a set of actions. So they're building upon the experiences from their previous crimes. And with the Zodiac, is that really what happened? I'm not convinced of that at all. I'm not convinced of that for a second because what the Zodiac is doing doesn't necessarily seem like he's building upon experiences. It seems like he's somewhat of a wild card. Yeah, you have the Lake Herman Road murders and the Blue Rock Springs shooting. Those are rather similar, but then the Lake Berryessa stabbing is so different. It violates everything about patterns of behaviors, with the exception of, okay, the persona has been created, so now he's committing a crime in a hooded costume, carrying a knife, a gun, and rope, by knife, and by gun. And he's putting this plan into action. That makes a little bit of sense, but then to go from that hooded costume to the Stein murder, killing a taxi driver 2 weeks later with no hooded costume and no knife. And SoCal 209 says, D'Angelo, though a highly organized killer, did at times commit a crime of opportunity. Oh, yeah, certainly. Joseph D'Angelo committed crimes of opportunity. And I was discussing this somewhat on the last Zodiac Killer news report, which came out on Monday, that the names of the victims were Brian and Katie Maggiore and the murder of Gregory Sanchez. Those crimes were done purely for defense. Or SoCal 209, do you mean that the Golden State Killer would commit a crime that was not planned? I mean, the Golden State Killer was even more cold, methodical, and calculating than the Zodiac. The Golden State Killer is some guy who would hide in the bushes for 4 hours, waiting for people to come home to attack them. 4 hours in the 1970s. No electronics, no phones, no Wi-Fi. Just sitting there. Absolutely. He is like someone who's planning a lot of things out. But yes, he did commit crimes because he was trying to get away from the crime scenes and he was going to be interrupted, or just the whole concept of this guy has cornered me, murdering him is the only way out. Those would be the murders of Brian Maggiore and Gregory Sanchez. But Melissa Tappa says Lake Berryessa was different with the exception of SoCal 1963. 1963, the Domingos Edwards murders, the murders of Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards, who were killed in a rather similar way. If that was the same killer, here's another piece of not exactly conflicting evidence, but conflicting information. I have said for a very long time that I thought that the murders of Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards were a sexual assault that was gone wrong. And the reason for this is Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards were on a beach in Southern California on June 4th of 1963. Somebody attacked them carrying a gun, a knife, and pre-cut lengths of rope. And Robert Domingos was tied up, and Linda Edwards had her swimsuit cut, and her breasts were revealed. So I was thinking, it seems like the guy was tied up. The offender cut her swimsuit open because he was planning to cut it all the way down and rip the swimsuit open so he would have access to her for sexual reasons, to commit a sexual assault. Maybe something about making the boyfriend or fiance watch, maybe just about incapacitating him because he was trying to commit this act. Then Robert Domingos breaks free, runs over, starts punching the perpetrator in the face, grabs Linda Edwards and runs, and then the person gets back on his feet, takes his .22 caliber firearm, which may have been a rifle, and shoots them 26 times, or 26 bullets are fired. That's what I thought for the longest time. But when I was reading John Douglas's book, The Cases That Haunt Us, one thing that he stated was a piece of different information, and that is that would mean that this was somewhat of an unorganized murder. Nobody knew where Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards were at the time. They were supposed to go out with friends, and even if somebody knew, They didn't go with the group. They went off on their own. It was a senior skip day, a ditch day, and they were by themselves. And I mean, even if somebody knew that they were going to the beach, they went off on their own, in their own direction, by their own accord. They went off by themselves. So that really indicates that the perpetrator did not have a lot of familiarity with the victims. And what John Douglas said was that with disorganized crimes, where someone is not going out to target a specific person, sexual assaults can be less likely to happen. The organized offenders are more likely to commit sexual assaults or rape. And you can see this very clearly in other serial killers like Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. I mean, he primarily targeted prostitutes. Robert Christian Hansen, the butcher baker from Alaska, primarily targeted sex workers. So they were going after people whom they could lure into their vehicles. And Gary Ridgway would more or less attack people in the act. He told them that if she was to turn around, he could finish his business more quickly. Then he would go for her neck. Robert Christian Hansen did something rather bizarre where he would actually hunt people for sport. He would say that that's what a cough sounds like when you don't let the air out. What he would do is he would say that the woman would get into his car and he could take a handcuff and put it on her wrist like a reflex. Then he would drive her to his plane, hold her up at gunpoint, put her on the plane, transport her to the wilderness, and then release her and hunt her down with a Ruger Mini 14 rifle. He hunted people for sport. But those are organized crimes. Those are organized thinkers. They're not the disorganized kind. So, according to somebody like John Douglas, my ideas about the Domingos Edwards murders are in some conflict. It's not impossible, though, and this is why I told you that all of these psychological profilers are a little bit overrated, because things are not set in stone. What I always imagined about the Domingos Edwards murders was either somebody was in the seaside shack that was nearby, or somebody's driving down Route 101 in California, and they saw a car that was parked there. So they got out, and then they saw Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards on the beach, and they're just thinking, they're in a vulnerable place. I'm going to attack them. And no matter what, I think that's what happened. And I'm sure the authorities know whether the person was staying in the seaside shack that was nearby, or was there a set of footprints or evidence going down the hill, and footprints in the sand even possibly, that would indicate where the killer came from, which direction. But it's quite possible the killer was actually in the seaside shack, because they found boxes of .22 caliber ammunition there. So this person sees them in a vulnerable place and he attacks them. Very normal for a man and a woman, a couple in a romantic situation in a secluded area, to be attacked. Some people get very bothered when they see people experiencing intimacy that they aren't allowed to experience, that they aren't capable of experiencing. And I mean, I've been through the lists of murders that took place so many times, and one of them, though, that I do hope to come back to is the Atlanta Lovers Lane Killer. And the Atlanta Lovers Lane Killer committed 3 shootings in Atlanta of couples that were parked in Lovers Lane settings. And they thought that the killer was going to strike again. They were almost certain that the killer would strike again. People who start those types of activities don't just commit 3 shootings and move on. They're like the Zodiac Killer. They would at least murder somebody else like Paul Stein. They're like the Phantom Killer, who would at least murder somebody else like Virgil Starks. But the Lovers Lane Killer didn't operate again. And there really is not too much that I can share about that. It's just that I just want to point out that I don't know everything. And I am somebody who has had to admit that I am sometimes faced with contradictory evidence when it comes to some of the hypothesizing and theorizing that I have done. And the Domingos Edwards murders is a case example about that, where John Douglas stated that a disorganized serial killer is less likely to commit the sexual assault than the organized killer. Now, with Jack the Ripper is somebody who was perhaps a little bit more in line with some of the ideas that were shared in Confessions of a Serial Killer. the type of person where not every crime is the same, but there is a clear form of escalation. The killer is building upon the experiences from the past. Say, for example, you would have, firstly, the murder of Martha Tabram, stabbed 39 times. The murder of Polly Nichols, stabbed and mutilated. The murder of Annie Chapman, stabbed, mutilated, disemboweled, and her intestines are pulled out. The murders of Liz Stride and Catherine Eddowes. They are two victims. There is a double event. Two women were murdered in one night, and then the murder of Mary Kelly, which is a little bit different in its own right. The murder of Mary Kelly is just completely mutilated beyond recognition. That is a clear form of escalation. That's what I think that the individuals were talking about when they're stating that this is somebody who is taking the experiences of the previous crimes and building upon them. And even if the crimes aren't identical, that would still be evidence for a single killer. With the Zodiac is all over the map. And this is one of the reasons why I began to just think that there were multiple killers. And I said for a very long time that I thought just that was the answer to everything, multiple killers. But the more you get under the surface, you realize that, well, one person could have done this. They could have just been changing the way that they were committing the crimes. And, with the Zodiac, I really want to see the case solved. I really hope that the case will be solved. And I know some people like Melissa Rose Tappa are working very hard to try and get their findings examined, and more power to her. And she is the webmaster of ZodiacKillerBomb.com. I invite everyone to check it out. But the problem is, though, as more time goes by, more and more evidence is going to disappear. Maybe they can extract more DNA off of things, but I don't want to sound like I'm being pessimistic. It's just my optimism is in a little bit of a challenge. And with the Zodiac case, the evidence was poorly preserved. With the D.B. Cooper case, the evidence was poorly preserved. Evidence was lost. And even when I was watching these documentaries about Otis Toole and his most famous crime, the murder of Adam Walsh, the son of John Walsh from America's Most Wanted, that's another example of how the evidence was poorly preserved. Otis Toole is saying that he cut Adam Walsh's head in the back of a car, and then John Walsh is even saying, all right, well, if he cut his head on the back of a car, there should be blood all over the seat and the floor mat, and, well, what happened to the floor mat that had all the blood on it once you found his vehicle? And the response from the authorities was, it was lost. And, you could just see John Walsh on the biography channel just freaking out and shouting. It's like, this is perhaps the most widely publicized murder in the state of Florida at the time, and the evidence is lost. He's like, what is wrong with these people? But guess what? These types of stories happen all of the time. With Jack the Ripper, it's not extremely shocking. It's been, 120 years or something like that since Jack the Ripper started operating, 130 years. That's bound to happen at some point. But this was happening in contemporary times. With the Zodiac case, it's just happening in contemporary times. Countless examples of just the authorities mishandling evidence, not preserving the evidence, losing evidence, not coming forward immediately, like Donald Falk waiting 1 month to come forward with an eyewitness sighting of a possible Zodiac after the Stein murder. Melissa Tappa says, what if there were multiple motives? Oh, for the Zodiac? Well, Melissa, I would love to know what you think about that if you put some more detail in the comment section. What would you think about multiple motives for the Zodiac to operate? Now, with the killers that I've been talking about, Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole, absolutely they had multiple motives. Childhood trauma, revenge on society, internalized rage and aggression, sexual factors and components. And with Jack the Ripper, I think that it's very similar. With the Zodiac, though, it becomes less and less apparent as to why the Zodiac was committing these crimes, because Jack the Ripper is getting up close and personal with the victims. Let's say, for example, if Otis Toole did commit the murders that he said that he did, like the murder of Adam Walsh was decapitated. There definitely is somebody getting up close and personal with the victims, experiencing some type of rage that needs to be unleashed. But the Zodiac simply does not do that when he has the opportunity to do so. The Zodiac seems like somebody who wants to commit the crimes and get away. That might be one of the few examples of something that is truly consistent in the Zodiac Killer mystery. He doesn't linger around, linger around at the crime scenes for very long. He doesn't spend time with the victims after he has attacked them, because you're going to see all these stories of some of the twisted serial killers out there, even Ted Bundy engaged in necrophilia and coming back to find the victims. You can also find in people who were not serial killers, like the murder of Elise Paler from Arroyo Grande, California, who was murdered by the 3 teenagers who tried to blame the band Slayer for writing songs with destructive imagery in their lyrics. They also participated in necrophilia. Some killers want to be with the victim, and they want to do this to experience a certain type of power. The Zodiac absolutely did not want to do that, because he had multiple opportunities to do so, and he's not even making sure that the victims are dead. So that's what leads people like me, and Richard Grinnell has expressed some similar ideas, that the Zodiac just wants to do this so he can get his name in the paper, so he can create his persona, so he can create his ciphers and codes. Donald Colley is here. He says, "Hey, Ned, and hi, all." Hey, Donald, welcome to True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. Please feel free to drop anything you want in the live chat. So, overall, though, I think that, Melissa could be right. There could be multiple motives. Now, some people out there think that this is done for a specific calculating reason. It's about sending messages. It's about creating these types of ciphers to share some type of coded message, CIA connections, and so on. That could be something to the effect. And a lot of people are going down the CIA rabbit hole, and I'll be talking more about that on Zodiac Monday, even though I'm not the biggest believer in those connections. The fact of the matter is, people have put their findings out there, so I choose to evaluate them. But as far as just, I guess what Ray Grant would call the sad, lonely man, a lot of people believe that the Zodiac Killer was indeed either a sad, lonely man, or in FLM, frustrated, lonely man, somebody who maybe had a particular life, like a marriage with kids. Some people believe that the Zodiac was absolutely married with children, and that he did this because he was just not satisfied with the way that his life turned out, so he wanted to do something to restore a broken ego. You can see this time and time again with the theories involving William Joseph Grant that are put forward by people like Les Lundblad and Lyndon Lafferty, and even Robert Graysmith talks about this in Zodiac with Arthur Lee Allen, that Arthur Lee Allen's life fell apart somewhat, and that he was trying to become the Zodiac Killer to restore the broken ego. Now, with serial killers like Henry Lee Lucas and Ottis Toole, I don't know about restoring a broken ego. I think that they were more or less the victims of trauma. And they were the victims of people. They were the victims of abuse. And it's the concept of the abused abuse. The people who are traumatized want to recreate the cycle of destructive behaviors. The child who is not loved by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. And Melissa has clarified something about her statement saying, what if there are multiple motives in the Zodiac Killer mystery? Could multiple motives cause him to switch up his MO and target victims in different scenarios? He was certainly a disturbed person and harbored a general sense of anger he unleashes, for example. Yeah, absolutely. And what I've talked about before on True Crime Talk Radio is, for a long time, I believe that the Zodiac may have had a personal connection to Cecilia Shepard, and that's why he's wearing the mask at Lake Berryessa and disguising his voice. That crime was personal. Maybe to Brian Hartnell as well. Maybe he knew Brian Hartnell, and that crime was personal. Although I think that Cecilia Shepard would be the specific target in that scenario, because something just tells me, maybe it's just an instinct, that the Zodiac hated women, and he had more of a problem with women than he did with men. And even John Douglas wrote about this in The Cases That Haunt Us. And you can go through my standalone episode on him. It's one of these live discussions, but you can go through that one here if you'd like to hear all the observations and my responses to John Douglas and the cases that haunt us about the Zodiac Killer. And Melissa says, the SFPD was his target, or victim by proxy, while his other victims were quite innocent and had no power position. He was mad at society and culture, etc. Oh yes, and one of the loudest voices about that was Sphere the Cube, whom I was talking about on the most recent Zodiac Killer news report. I think that Sphere's best observations are about how and why the Zodiac chose to act. Because you read something like a bus bomb letter, you read something about the Zodiac Killer saying that he wants to target school children. You read something about the Zodiac saying that there's more glory in shooting a cop than shooting a kid because the kid can fight back. What's all this stuff going at? Even the misspellings of the words. What is all this? And what Sphere simply says is, the Zodiac was making a mockery of everything. He was making a mockery of everything in society. What would be some examples of this? Number one, misspellings in the words, making a mockery of education. Did the Zodiac make a mockery of the police officers? All the time? He's like, the pigs couldn't catch me, the blue meanies couldn't catch me, they won't catch me because I have been too clever. And also, there are examples of making a mockery of religion. The Zodiac is even saying something that is his own personal religious belief. When I die, I will be reborn in paradise, and those who I have killed will be my slaves. He's making a mockery of all of the major elements of society. And, he's mad at society, he's mad at culture. How about the hippie movement? How about just hating the hippie movement? Because a lot of people in the 1960s were opposed to the hippies. Even the Manson family, to a certain extent, they more or less just used them for practicality. The Church of Satan was completely opposed to the hippies. They thought that these people were just absolute hypocrites talking about peace, love, and joy, when in reality, they're like, you're just all about material selfishness. We're going to go join the Church of Satan with Anton LaVey. Earl Van Best is going to play the piano for us. I hear he's quite good at it. And so, yes, the Zodiac could be doing something like that. But that stuff all exists in theory. Like about how and why he was choosing to do that. Like the underlying meanings of the Zodiac's letters. It's so hard to pinpoint what someone was actually thinking if they have not been identified. But guess what? Here's the problem, though. This is where everything comes together, and after the 50-minute mark, that's amazing for True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. Even if, some way, somehow, they were able to identify the Zodiac Killer, just ask him to tell us everything. Think about everything I've said about Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole. Think about everything that I've said about these people. They lied. They didn't tell the truth. They had the chance to confess, and they just made up a bunch of wild stuff because it was beneficial for their selfishness at the time. It suited their agenda. Who really knows what the Zodiac Killer was thinking? But the long and short of it, the point that I was trying to get to was, at first, I thought the Zodiac Killer would have been a very organized recipe for murder style killer. The Zodiac would have been a very organized checklist style killer. But now, I don't necessarily think so. I think the Zodiac could have done a lot of unorganized things, disorganized things, and maybe he didn't put things in. Maybe he didn't put as much thought into this as I had originally planned. Maybe I was giving the Zodiac too much credit, and he actually did a lot of spur of the moment things. Because this is the whole conflict. This is what John Douglas is trying to explore. Why are some criminals doing this where they spend months making this recipe for murder, and other criminals are doing this just because they get angry one night? Why? And the honest answer is different elements in their psychology and their upbringing are driving people to commit crimes this way. And I was once listening to an episode of Free Domain Radio, which has now been deplatformed. It was hosted by Stefan Molyneux. And he said some similar things to Dr. Michael Stone that I was talking about at the beginning, such as, some people will contemplate murder, but the contemplation of murder is really quite different than drawing out blueprints for the crime. Drawing out blueprints would be a lot more intense and a lot more severe and much, riskier for someone's mental health and society. It's it's a more intense mental issue. But the creation of the recipe for murder or the checklist for murder is in line with drawing out blueprints. It's akin to drawing out blueprints for the crimes. And I wouldn't be convinced if the Zodiac drew out blueprints for these things. It seems like he's a lot less thoughtful than I originally expected. Jack the Ripper, no need to make any blueprints for anything. Jack the Ripper is just kind of roaming around the city looking for a woman to cut apart. And the Ripper was not really, I haven't seen anything that the Ripper put any major thought into his crimes. The only thing Jack the Ripper seems to be good at was running away. D.B. Cooper, though, D.B. Cooper may have planned everything down to a T. Now, he's not a serial killer. D.B. Cooper didn't murder anyone, to the best of our knowledge. Maybe if your suspect is Robert Rackstraw, maybe he did. But D.B. Cooper would be somebody who either planned everything down to a T or he just jumped into the clouds and died. Who knows? And we have a super chat from Jeff Jones. Jeff Jones, thank you so much. Jeff Jones says, good to see you, Ned. Hey, good to see you, Jeff Jones. Thank you for stopping by. And welcome to True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. We are approaching the 1 hour mark, but feel free to put anything you want in the live chat at the comment section. This episode is going to be winding down, but if anybody has any final observations about any of the true crime cases that I've been talking about in this episode, Samuel Scheinbein and the murder of Freddie Tello, the serial killer's oddest tool, and Henry Lee Lucas, Jack the Ripper, and the Zodiac, please put your ideas in the comment section down below. Now, some people are going to also create these types of organized crimes, like Samuel Scheinbein and Aaron Benjamin Needle, where they made the checklist, where they made the recipe for murder, because they have a very specific target, and it's done for very specific reasons. They knew exactly which person they were going to target, even though it was a practice murder. They murdered an individual named Freddie Tello to practice to murder another victim. And Jeff says, I will watch this on replay. Jeff, thank you so much. You're awesome. The Fox would approve. But with the Zodiac and Jack the Ripper, I'm not necessarily convinced that they did any of that stuff. As I said, I thought the Ripper was just walking around looking for whoever was available. A murder was planned, but the victims were not pre-chosen. And there's not a lot of thought that's put into the crime. And you guys know I go back and forth on the Zodiac a lot. Say, for example, with the murder of Cecilia Shepard. I was just telling you that I highly entertained the idea that the Zodiac was using Cecilia Shepard as a specific target, that she was the one with whom he had a personal connection. Yeah, the other people are murdered because of his own psychological issues and homicidal rage, but Cecilia was targeted because they knew something personal. That's why that crime was committed by knife. Other people think that Cecilia Shepard and Sherry Jo Bates may have known each other from Riverside. Sherry Jo Bates could be a possible pre-Zodiac victim, and she was killed by knife, so he's murdering the Riverside girls by knife and so on. That exists purely in theory as well. But as far as this type of thought process where the Zodiac could have been pre-choosing victims and creating the recipe for murder, I just think there's insufficient evidence to support that. He may have been somebody who was just really mad in December of 1968, maybe someone who didn't have anywhere to go for Christmas, and then he saw David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen sitting in a car, so he drove over and just shot them. Then he drove away and just thinking, oh my gosh, what did I do? Did I really do that? I don't believe this. And then he just spends 6 months thinking, what? What happened? I can't believe I did that. No one's done anything about it. No one has even a clue about what happened. You know what? I'm going to try this again. I did it once. I got away with it. On the 4th of July, he does the exact same thing. Almost in the same way. He doesn't let the victims get out of the car this time because Betty Lou Jensen tried to run away, so he shot them inside the car. And he killed Darlene Ferrin. Mike Mageau survived, but the reason why he didn't make sure that either one of the victims was dead at the time is because he really just wanted to recreate the Lake Herman Road murders. And then he just gets in his car, drives away, and I think he went to a parking lot for about 20 to 30 minutes by himself, and he's just kind of thinking, wow, that's, an amazing experience. It's a thrilling experience. I'm starting to like this feeling. Terrible. Terrible. But this is what I think the killer could be ruminating on. And he makes a phone call, starts bragging about it. Again, nobody has caught the guy. So he starts writing in these letters, and he now has this persona that he wants to create by saying, I'm the murderer of the teenagers. And he's created this cipher, and then he chooses the name Zodiac because it had personal connection to him. He saw it on the watch, he saw it on the boat, he heard it in the movie Charlie Chan at Treasure Island. So then he puts that into a letter that's mailed in August of 1969, saying, this is the Zodiac speaking. Now he has the persona, he has the letters, he has the ciphers. Even if they figured it out, they didn't actually get his name. His name wasn't in the cipher to begin with. So, what's the next step? What's the next step? He's going to add another element to the Zodiac persona, and that is the hooded costume and the message on the car door. This is so far all in line with Confessions of a Serial Killer, taking certain elements from the previous crimes and expanding upon them. And even Vincent McConnell talks about other things that a single killer would do. Taking the phone and hanging up after the Blue Rock Springs call, somebody calls back. Taking the phone after Lake Berryessa, leaving it off the hook. So then, the Zodiac is thinking, all right, I've already committed murders. I created the letters. I created the ciphers. I created the hooded costume. I made the phone calls. I wrote the message on the car door. I left all of these signatures. You know what? I'm going to do something that's going to confuse everybody. I'm just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Well, how much bigger am I going to get? You know, am I going to start like filming this and mailing this in to people? No. Some people think that, like Jack Myers, author of The Son of Zodiac. I don't think like that. The Zodiac is going to be like, you know, I've committed 3 Lover's Lane shootings and 1 stabbing, 2 shootings, 1 stabbing, 3 Lover's Lane style attacks, 3 attacks. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go after a taxi driver in Presidio Heights. No one will see that coming. But it's going to be rather easy. I'm going to get him to drive to a desired location, and I'm going to cut off a piece of his bloody shirt so they know it's me. This is completely different than the previous crimes, but they know that's me. I'm going to mail this in with multiple letters, and I'm going to tell the story of how I did it, and I'm going to prove that I can commit murder, get away with the crimes, and that's ultimately the end of it. After that, the Zodiac is like, I'm just going to focus on the letters and the ciphers. I've already done everything there is to do, such as committing murders, creating the persona, writing these letters and cryptograms, making a costume, writing the message on the car door, mailing in pieces of the bloody shirt. There's no other way that I can commit the crimes that is even remotely a challenge anymore. I'm just going to make more intricate ciphers that they're never going to solve. The Z13, Z32, too few symbols. And if you're listening to this at a future event, at a future date, please let me know what you think about that Zodiac theory. Melissa says, I truly believe this is the Zodiac speaking, clues us into his aviation and naval background. Yeah, it could. It could. What was that? It could be from the story Sign Z by Edwin Baird that has the serial killer that says, this is Z calling. That was in Detective Story magazine. That's just the other possibility that comes to mind. And if anybody else has any final things, they can put them in the comments section down below. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is Ned DeHaan, and there's always BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram. And if you would like to support all of these efforts with Zodiac Monday, Ripper Wednesday, Cooper Friday, and Tuesday and Thursday going live at True Crime Talk Radio in the morning, you can go to BuyMeACoffee.com. BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNed88 allows you to make a donation or a contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And I will be back live for True Crime Talk Radio in the morning on Tuesday. And for now, you can say goodbye to the Fox. The Fox will be back here next Thursday. Everybody, have a wonderful morning. Have a wonderful day. And I will see you over on Cooper Friday, talking about DB Cooper. All right, everybody, take care now. That'll be all for me, and until next time.